So these and other factors combine to confront us with a tremendous challenge. We need to respond to this challenge. And yet, as human beings, we find it difficult to do so because, again, change is naturally difficult. But the kinds of threats that we naturally respond to automatically and viscerally are the kinds of threats that our ancient ancestors survived. And they passed on those abilities to us. But in this case, we have to use our reasoning capacity. The impacts are distributed globally, so it can masquerade as an abstraction. And the time period between the causes and the consequences is somewhat longer than we are used to dealing with. And since more than 2/3 of the Earth is covered by the oceans, most of the heat is absorbed into the oceans initially, and then is re-emitted into the atmosphere after a time lag. And that is one of the reasons why the scientists have been warning us that we need to act now, because we can't wait until we see the full effect, because by then it would be too late. Now the good news is we have the capacity as human beings to reason together. We have the capacity to communicate with one another and share a decision to respond to this and to do something about it, especially since the solutions are things that are good for us anyway, that we ought to be doing anyway. Again, to those of you in business, there has been a lot of experience in the business community with what happens when large risks are ignored. The global economic crisis that I mentioned before really began in my country, unfortunately, with something called the subprime mortgage crisis. I'm sure you know all about that. Well, what happened was, in contrast to my experience, when I first signed a mortgage 40 years ago, I made a down payment, and I showed proof that I could make the regular monthly payments on my mortgage. But those two requirements were dispensed with for millions of people. And obviously, that should have alerted the business community that there was a risk involved. Because if you give a mortgage to someone who cannot pay it back, then there's a chance they will not pay it back. But all of these subprime mortgages were lumped together and then securitized and sold into the global marketplace, and people assumed, well, the risk is gone. Well, it wasn't gone. And when that instrument was tested, it failed. And then the credit crisis emerged, and the Great Recession followed. Well, the value of those mortgages was held up artificially high by the assumption that there was no risk, that somehow the risk had magically gone away. A few people saw the risk and pointed it out, but they were ignored. Today, the world economy has approximately $7 trillion worth of subprime carbon assets, coal and oil mainly, whose value is based on the assumption that it's perfectly all right to dump 90 million tons of global warming pollution into the atmosphere as if it's an open sewer. It's not all right. And it can't continue. That assumption will also collapse. When? I don't know. But I do know that it will collapse during the time period that responsible business managers should be keeping in mind as they are planning for the future. Because at some point, the world is going to awaken and find a way to put a price on these carbon assets that reflects the current inefficient way in which they're being used, which is posing these unacceptably high risks to the survival of human civilization on this planet as we know it. Now, I've talked a couple of times about the solutions, and I want to end with a couple more words about what the solutions are. I mentioned the role of telecommunications. I mentioned efficiency, but I want to underscore the fact that higher levels of efficiency in business represent the single most important solution. New sources of energy. I mentioned solar energy. Enough sunlight falls on the surface of the earth in 1 hour to provide all of the energy the world needs for an entire year. And the efficiency with which that sunlight is now being converted into electricity is improving quickly. And the greater the demand for these photovoltaic solar panels and other forms of solar energy, the more research and development expenditures will rise, and the sharper the cost will come down. We're already seeing that. You're familiar with what happened with computer chips. The cost has been cut in half by 50% every 2 years for 30 to 40 years. And that's not a law of physics. It's called Moore's Law, but it's not a law of nature. It is a law of business investment. They saw the future demand for computer chips. In 2010, there are 1 billion transistors for every man, woman, and child on the earth. They saw that coming. And so they saw their competitors were bringing the cost down, and they made the R&D expenditures necessary to stay on that curve so that they could keep or even increase their market share. If the world made a decision to accelerate the shift to photovoltaic solar energy cells, you would see a global competition, not just China leading the way so they can dominate that industry, which they're on the way to doing, but every nation getting into that competition so that those jobs could be in Peru, in the United States, and in the places where these industries are developed. Wind power is similarly a very promising renewable source of energy. In my nation, for each of the last 3 years, the largest source of new electricity generation has been from wind. Coal plants are declining as a percentage of energy. And oil goes into the transportation sector, but now electric cars are being introduced. And in every nation, we're seeing a wave of new electric cars anticipated, which leads to another new solution, which is the introduction of what are called smart grids. The old electricity grids waste energy. There are unplanned outages that disrupt business and disrupt lives. The new 21st century smart grids can minimize the losses, eliminate the unplanned outages, and give business people and students and consumers the ability to be very precise in locating where the wasteful uses of energy are and eliminate them. Again, reducing their electricity bills, becoming more efficient and profitable at the same time that they are also reducing pollution. A lot of people are promoting nuclear energy and the capture and sequestration of CO2 emissions, and both of those technologies are being pursued. Both, in my opinion, are likely to remain too expensive to play a large role, but both will play a significant role. Now, finally, there are many other solutions I could mention, but here in Peru, I want to pay particular attention to the role of forests, because as one of the great Amazon nations, this is a great part of your patrimony. And worldwide, about 17 to 18% of the global warming is caused by the destruction of forests. And it hurts in two ways. First of all, of course, the CO2 emissions and methane emissions accompany the destruction of the forest. But then the Earth's ability to reabsorb CO2 is diminished when the forest is cleared. And of course, in megadiversity nations like Peru, you also lose the habitat for these species that are ever more important, not only as a wonder of nature, but also increasingly as a source of the most valuable information on the planet, and that is the genetic information that has emerged over millions of years and is now being found to be uniquely valuable and useful in pharmaceuticals and in all kinds of new 21st century uses.